By early 1945, the war in the Pacific had reached a brutal and decisive phase. American forces were steadily closing in on Japan, and for the first time, the Japanese mainland itself had become a direct target. After years of fighting across islands scattered throughout the Pacific Ocean, the United States had secured key bases close enough to launch sustained bombing campaigns. One of the most important weapons in this new phase of the war was the B-29 Superfortress. This aircraft was unlike anything used before. It could fly higher, farther, and carry heavier bomb loads than previous bombers. At first, American strategy focused on high-altitude precision bombing. The goal was to destroy factories, military installations, and infrastructure with minimal spread. However, this strategy quickly proved ineffective. Strong winds at high altitude, especially the jet stream over Japan, caused bombs to drift far from their targets. Clouds and weather conditions often obscured visibility. Many missions resulted in little damage despite the massive effort required. This forced American commanders to rethink everything. General Curtis LeMay emerged as a central figure in this transformation. He was direct, aggressive, and focused on results. Instead of continuing ineffective precision strikes, he proposed a radical shift. His plan was simple but devastating. Bomb cities directly, and do it in a way that would guarantee destruction. LeMay ordered B-29 bombers to fly at low altitude, at night, and to use incendiary bombs instead of high-explosive ones. These bombs were specifically designed to start fires. And Japan, at that time, was extremely vulnerable to fire. Most Japanese cities were built with wood and paper. Houses stood close together. Narrow streets and dense neighborhoods meant that once a fire started, it could spread rapidly. Tokyo, the capital, was one of the most densely populated cities in the world. It was not only a political center but also a vast network of small factories and workshops that supported Japan's war production. This made Tokyo a perfect target. The plan was not just to bomb, it was to burn the city. On the night of March 9, 1945, preparations began for what would become one of the most devastating air raids in human history. Hundreds of B-29 bombers were assembled on airfields across the Pacific, especially on the island of Tinian. Each aircraft was loaded with incendiary bombs, many of them small cluster bombs designed to scatter and ignite fires across a wide area. Unlike previous missions, many defensive guns were removed from the bombers to reduce weight. This allowed them to carry even more bombs. Crews were briefed on the new tactics. They would fly lower than ever before, directly over the city, and release their payloads in a coordinated pattern. As night fell, the bombers began taking off one by one, engines roaring into the darkness. Inside each aircraft, the atmosphere was tense. The crews knew this mission was different. Flying lower meant greater risk from anti-aircraft fire. But it also meant they would see the results of their bombing much more clearly than before. Hours later, as the formation approached Tokyo, the city below appeared calm, unaware of what was about to happen. The first wave of bombers reached the city and began dropping incendiary bombs. These bombs exploded on impact, scattering burning material across rooftops and streets. Within minutes, small fires began appearing across multiple districts. Then more bombers arrived, and more. Each wave added fuel to the growing inferno. Soon, individual fires began merging into larger ones. The wind, already present, began to intensify as the heat rose. Flames spread rapidly from building to building, consuming entire neighborhoods in minutes. What had started as scattered fires was turning into something far more dangerous. A firestorm was beginning to form. As the temperature rose, the fire itself began to create its own weather system. Hot air rushed upward, pulling in cooler air from surrounding areas. This created powerful winds that fed the flames, making them burn hotter and spread faster. People on the ground found themselves trapped in a nightmare. Streets became rivers of fire. Buildings collapsed as the heat weakened their structures. The air filled with smoke, making it difficult to breathe or even see. Many tried to escape, running toward rivers or open areas, but the fire spread faster than they could move. Above the city, the crews of the B-29 bombers witnessed a scene unlike anything they had ever seen before. The entire city appeared to be on fire. From miles away, the glow of the flames lit up the night sky. Thick columns of smoke rose high into the atmosphere, visible even from distant aircraft. Some pilots later described it as looking like a massive furnace stretching across the horizon. The mission continued for hours as more bombers arrived and released their payloads. By the time the last aircraft turned away, Tokyo was no longer just a city under attack. It was a city engulfed in flames. As the firestorm intensified, the situation on the ground became almost unimaginable. The flames were no longer separate fires spreading from building to building. They had merged into a single, massive inferno that consumed entire districts at once. The heat grew so intense that it began to melt materials, warp metal, and ignite anything flammable within seconds. Winds created by the firestorm reached terrifying speeds. Air was being sucked toward the center of the blaze, pulling oxygen into the flames and making them even stronger. These winds were powerful enough to knock people off their feet and carry burning debris through the air, spreading the fire even further. For civilians trapped in the city, escape became nearly impossible. Many families were asleep when the bombing began. By the time they realized what was happening, fires had already surrounded entire neighborhoods. People rushed into the streets, trying to flee, but the narrow roads quickly filled with panic and confusion. The heat alone was deadly. Even those far from the center of the flames could feel the temperature rising rapidly. Clothes began to catch fire. Skin burned from the intense heat radiating through the air. Breathing became painful as smoke and ash filled the lungs. Some people ran toward canals and rivers, believing water would offer safety. Thousands gathered along riverbanks, jumping into the water to escape the flames. But even there, safety was not guaranteed. The firestorm consumed oxygen in the air, and many suffocated. Others drowned as the crowded waters turned chaotic. Entire districts disappeared in a matter of hours. Wooden houses burned almost instantly. Fire spread across rooftops, through windows, and along streets, creating walls of flame that cut off escape routes. The city's infrastructure collapsed under the pressure. Communication lines failed, emergency services were overwhelmed, and there was no coordinated response that could stop what was happening. Above the city, the bombers continued their mission. From their altitude, the crews could see the firestorm growing larger with each passing minute. The glow from Tokyo illuminated the clouds, creating an eerie orange light that stretched across the sky. Some pilots later reported that the updrafts from the fire were so strong that they could feel their aircraft being lifted by the heat. The scale of destruction was unlike anything they had ever witnessed. Even for experienced crews who had participated in many bombing missions, this was different. This was not a single target being hit. This was an entire city burning. As the hours passed, the firestorm reached its peak. Temperatures in some areas became so high that survival was impossible. Entire blocks were reduced to ash. Vehicles, buildings, and even roads were destroyed or rendered unrecognizable. The intense heat created conditions where the ground itself seemed to glow. For those still trying to escape, every direction led to more fire. Some attempted to shelter in open areas, but the firestorm's winds carried flames and embers across distances, igniting new fires even in places that initially seemed safe. Others sought refuge in buildings made of stronger materials, but many of these structures also succumbed to the heat. The night seemed endless. Hour after hour, the city continued to burn. The sky above Tokyo remained lit by flames, turning darkness into a constant, flickering light. The sound of the fire, combined with collapsing buildings and distant explosions, created a relentless and overwhelming noise. Eventually, as the bombers completed their mission and began returning to their bases, the firestorm started to lose intensity. But by then, the damage had already been done. What remained of Tokyo was a vast expanse of destruction. Entire neighborhoods had vanished. Streets that once held thousands of homes were now covered in ash and debris. The scale of the devastation would only become fully clear in the days that followed. For those who survived, the morning revealed a city transformed beyond recognition. Where there had once been life, movement, and activity, there was now silence. The night Tokyo burned had changed everything. When morning finally came, the full scale of what had happened during the night began to reveal itself. The fires had largely burned out, but what remained was not a city struggling to recover. It was a landscape of devastation stretching as far as the eye could see. Entire districts of Tokyo had been reduced to ashes. Buildings, homes, and streets that had existed for generations were gone, replaced by burned ground and scattered debris. The silence that followed was as shocking as the destruction itself. In many areas, there were no sounds of daily life, no movement, no activity. Survivors wandered through the ruins, searching for family members, trying to understand what had happened, and attempting to find any sign of what their lives had been just hours before. The scale of loss was overwhelming. Estimates of casualties began to emerge, and they were staggering. Tens of thousands of people had lost their lives in a single night. In some areas, entire communities had been wiped out. The number of injured was even higher, with many suffering severe burns, smoke inhalation, and other life-threatening conditions. Medical facilities, already limited, were unable to handle the sheer number of victims. The bombing of Tokyo on the night of March 9–10, 1945, would later be recognized as one of the deadliest air raids in history. What made it particularly devastating was not just the number of bombs dropped, but the method used. The combination of low-altitude bombing and incendiary weapons had created conditions that maximized destruction. The firestorm that followed turned the city itself into a weapon against its own population. In the days that followed, efforts began to assess the damage and provide aid to survivors. However, the situation was extremely difficult. Infrastructure had been destroyed, roads were blocked or damaged, communication systems were unreliable, food and water supplies were limited. Many people were left without shelter, forced to live among the ruins of what had once been their homes. Despite the devastation, the war continued. The bombing of Tokyo was not an isolated event. It was part of a larger campaign aimed at weakening Japan's ability to continue fighting. In the weeks and months that followed, other cities would also face similar attacks, though few would experience destruction on the same scale as Tokyo that night. For American military planners, the results of the raid were seen as confirmation that the new strategy was effective. Industrial production in the affected areas was severely disrupted. Transportation systems were damaged. The ability of the city to support the war effort was reduced. From a strategic perspective, the mission had achieved its objective. But the human cost was immense. The bombing raised serious questions about the nature of modern warfare. It blurred the line between military and civilian targets, as entire urban areas were treated as legitimate objectives due to their connection to war production. This approach reflected the total war conditions of the time, where the distinction between front lines and home front had largely disappeared. For Japan, the attack was a devastating blow. It demonstrated that even the capital was no longer safe and that American forces had the capability to strike deep into the country with devastating effect. Morale was affected, and the pressure on Japanese leadership continued to increase as the situation grew more desperate. At the same time, the bombing of Tokyo foreshadowed what was still to come. In the months ahead, the war would reach its final and most dramatic stage, culminating in events that would change the world forever. The destruction of Tokyo showed what fire could do to a city. Soon, an even more powerful weapon would demonstrate an entirely new level of destruction. Looking back, the night Tokyo burned stands as one of the most significant and tragic events of the Second World War. It was a moment when strategy, technology, and circumstance combined to produce destruction on a massive scale. It showed the power of air warfare and the vulnerability of cities in the modern age. And it left behind a legacy that continues to be remembered as one of the darkest nights in history. The flames that consumed Tokyo that night did more than destroy a city. They revealed the true cost of total war. As the war moved closer to its conclusion, the bombing of Tokyo remained one of the clearest examples of how far warfare had evolved during the 20th century. It was no longer defined only by battles between armies on the ground or fleets at sea. Entire cities had become targets, and the destruction of infrastructure, industry, and civilian life had become central to military strategy. The events of that single night in March 1945 demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of air power when combined with new tactics and weapons. In the months that followed, similar bombing campaigns continued across Japan. Other cities experienced widespread destruction, though each had its own scale and impact. Yet even among these attacks, the firebombing of Tokyo stood out because of its intensity and the speed at which destruction spread. It was not just an attack. It was a transformation of the battlefield itself, where fire became the dominant force. When compared to later events, particularly the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Tokyo raid often receives less attention. However, in terms of immediate destruction and loss of life in a single night, it remains one of the most devastating air raids in history. The difference was not in the intent, but in the method. In Tokyo, destruction came from fire spreading across the city. In Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it came from a single explosion. Both represented different paths toward the same outcome. They showed that modern warfare had reached a point where entire cities could be destroyed within hours, and in some cases, within seconds. This realization would shape military thinking for decades to come, influencing strategies, alliances, and the development of new weapons. For those who experienced the night Tokyo burned, the memory did not fade. Survivors carried the experience with them for the rest of their lives. The loss of homes, families, and entire communities left a lasting impact. In the years after the war, efforts were made to rebuild the city, and Tokyo would eventually rise again as one of the largest and most advanced cities in the world. But beneath that recovery remained the memory of what had happened. The bombing also left a broader legacy. It became part of the ongoing discussion about the ethics of war, the use of strategic bombing, and the balance between military objectives and human cost. Historians, scholars, and policymakers have continued to examine these events, trying to understand not only what happened, but why it happened and what lessons can be learned. The night of March 9–10, 1945, stands as a reminder of how quickly destruction can unfold when technology and strategy combine without limits. It also serves as a warning. The power demonstrated during that night was only a fraction of what would become possible in the years that followed. As new weapons were developed and the world entered the atomic age, the scale of potential destruction grew even greater. The lessons of Tokyo, therefore, extend beyond a single event or a single war. They speak to the broader reality of human conflict. In the end, the story of the night Tokyo burned is not only about fire and destruction. It is about the choices made during war, the consequences of those choices, and the lasting impact they leave behind. It is a story of strategy and survival, of innovation and devastation, and of a moment when a city was transformed in a single night. And even decades later, that night continues to echo through history as one of the most powerful reminders of what war can become when there are no limits.